Well, welcome to part one of the Classical Overture. This class was formerly called the Classical Primer, but we changed the title in order not to conflict with some publications that ICAA National has been working on over the years. So it's now called the Classical Overture. This is a class that we developed in Southern California chapter here of the ICAA as a relatively brief introduction to the elements and the rationale and the philosophy of classical architecture. Bear with me, there we go. For the past 15 years or so, I've been teaching this class at the beginning of our educational season. For most practitioners, a full understanding of classical architecture represents a lifetime of study. As an architect, I can truly say that nearly every day when I'm practicing what I do, I learn something new and discover some new insight or uncover some shiny new pebble that I hadn't known or considered before. But in the few hours allotted for this class, what I can hope to share with you is a glimpse of some of the key attributes which exemplify classical architecture and some of the ways that we can understand that classical architecture differs from other kinds of architecture, from modernist architectures. This is what we'll do tonight in part one. Next week in part two, we'll take a close look at the nature and the details and the character of the classical orders of architecture. And we'll conclude with exploring some of the reasons why I think that classical architecture is relevant to how we live today in the modern world. Firmitas, utilitas, venustas. This beautiful painting by the great contemporary classical painter David Lagar illustrates the Roman architect Vitruvius's criteria for good architecture. Firmitas, utilitas, venustas. Strength, function, and beauty. Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture was the first complete codification of the classical orders. And it's the only comprehensive architectural text written in antiquity and the only such text to survive to the present day. One of the things I find so appealing about classical architecture is that it is so incredibly nuanced. There are so many different ways to see it and to try to understand it and to try to find value in it. We can look at it through many complementary lenses. My goal for the talk this evening is to give you a broad overview of the language of classical architecture and to acquaint you with a few of the ways to see and understand that language. I think that Vitruvius's description is a perfect way to start our overview because it gives us three useful overlapping views, three lenses through which we can examine the language. Strength. We'll look at classical architecture through the lens of structure, how buildings resist the forces of gravity, and how they can tell us an understandable story about how they do that. Function. We'll examine together how the flexible language of classicism can accommodate so many human functions so efficiently and so gracefully. And we'll look at some of the strategies the language provides us to do this. And beauty. I'll try to help you understand why I think that this ephemeral quality is so important to us and how the language of classical architecture can clear us a path to help us find it. This is a photograph of a Palladian country house by Peter Penoyer. a contemporary classical architect. From the monumental to the mundane, classicism is a flexible language that can be used intuitively for all sorts of building. This evening, you'll often hear me refer to the language of classical architecture. I think this is a really helpful way to look at it, a very useful lens through which to see it. The individual elements of architecture, the small bits and pieces that comprise a room or a building or a landscape and give them recognizable character, can be looked at as comprising the grammar of a language, which the designer uses to communicate with the people who inhabit the spaces. This is an image by a contemporary classical architect, Quinlan Terry, great classical architect from Great Britain. This is actually a building in the United States. This is Merchant Square in Colonial Williamsburg, a commercial building designed by Mr. Terry. The fact that the language is a very old one does not mean that we cannot use this language to create buildings which are relevant to the way we live today. After all, we speak and communicate with each other using verbal and written languages, which, although they are continuously being embellished and modified to reflect contemporary life, have been largely unchanged for hundreds or thousands of years. This continuity reflects a kind of cultural consensus, a shared language of architecture, which we have built up together over time, where a basic understanding of the fundamentals of how buildings communicate with us is intuitively understood by all. This idea of cultural consensus is a really important one. Imagine if you woke up tomorrow morning and went out on your door stoop and retrieved your newspaper. And imagine, instead of finding it written in English, you discover it's been printed in a brand new language, invented by a clever journalist, reflecting some currently fashionable whim. You can understand why that would be a problem. So have a look at this image. You can see how the elements of the architecture, the way they are assembled, the bilateral symmetry, are all very carefully crafted to speak to us in a way that clearly communicates entrance. We don't need special inside knowledge of the philosophy of architecture to be able to grasp this. We have a shared understanding, which both reflects our nature as human beings and a cultural consensus which has been built up over millennia. The idea that buildings and landscapes should communicate with us deliberately and actively, conveying meaning and values, is an incredibly important theme which runs through the philosophy of classical architecture. So where do you suppose you enter this building? Well, if you look at it closely, you may be able to discern a door to the left of center on the ground level. It's not very easy to see, and it's clear that this building is not communicating with us in the same way the previous one did. By the way, my purpose this evening is not to denigrate modernist architecture. Like many architects of my generation, I was trained as a modernist. In my career, I've designed many buildings in modernist styles, and I admire many modernist buildings. My purpose is really to help you see that the goals and philosophies of modernism and classicism are very different, and to try to help you identify and understand some of those differences. Another beautiful building by Quinlan Terry, the British classicist. This is Downing College in Cambridge. Many of the traditional styles that we know and love use elements and variations and fragments of the classical language. Designs can range anywhere along a spectrum, from the pure rarefied high classical, appropriately reserved for the most important public structures, to the very humble local vernacular styles, that may use only a few explicitly classical elements, but reflect classical principles. Most European traditional styles, Greek, Italian, French, English, Spanish. American styles, East Coast and Southern regional styles, shingle and craftsman styles, the Spanish colonial revival that we know so well here in Southern California. A working knowledge of classical architectural elements is really essential to execute thoughtful work employing these kind of traditional languages. This is a beautiful church interior by Palladio, Andrea Palladio. This is the sanctuary at the monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. Ecclesiastical and sacred architecture. And this is an unexecuted project by Quinlan Terry again. This is the House of Worship, a cathedral for Tehran, a project from 1973, a contemporary classical building. I think this drawing really beautifully shows the geometry and the intricate character of great classical architecture and the beauty of the drawings. And this is a house by a contemporary classical architect, Dimitri Porphyrios. Here, the classical language is stripped down to its barest essentials, but the deep structure of this architecture is classical. And I hope by the end of this lecture, you'll understand a little bit about why that's so. This is a shingle style building by Robert A.M. Stern, American contemporary classical architect. And a Creole house by the great Louisiana architect A. Hayes Town. And a close-up of that building by A. Hayes Town. And I think this image really beautifully shows the merging of the classical and the vernacular along that spectrum that we talked about here. This beautifully humble stair ascending to a second-story porch, rendered in weathered wood, next to these beautiful Tuscan columns, which are so appropriate to the architecture. And the melding of the classical and the vernacular here is really poignant and beautiful. And this is a painting of the New York Municipal Building by McKim, Mead and White from 1915. This is a painting by Colin Campbell Cooper from 1922. Tall buildings of modern scope and conception can be designed using the classical language. New York City is filled with buildings like this. Not only can the classical language accommodate modern uses, this is Vitruvius's Utilitas, but they can do so in a way that stirs the soul. Vitruvius's Venustas. This is absolutely one of my favorite buildings in New York and well worth a visit if you've never been there. It's downtown, again, the Municipal Building by McKim, Mead and White from 1915. I think this facade is really quite amazing if you study it closely. The interweaving of the horizontal rhythm and the vertical rhythms is quite remarkable. Beautifully executed, and with that wonderful wedding cake finial on top, it's quite a miraculous building. And another photo of the Municipal Building, this time in winter. And another very famous classical building in Midtown Manhattan. This is, of course, Grand Central Terminal from 1903. The architects here were the great American Beaux-Arts architects Warren and Wetmore. and the magnificent interior of Grand Central, my favorite room in New York City. Absolutely. And from the sublime to the most humble, the humble Tuscan. This tiny rustic farm building, which was probably a storage shed or perhaps a stables building, was important enough to someone that they ennobled it with this beautiful and poignant column. How unlikely and how perfect. Classicism is a time-tested recipe for creating buildings and landscapes that have pleasing proportions, appropriate scale, structural logic, and human relevance. We often talk about the classical tradition. So what does that mean? Most of the great cultures have their own classical tradition. Asian cultures, China and Japan, for instance, or Arabic cultures, all have a classical tradition and classical architecture of their own. But in the West, when we refer to the classical tradition in arts and architecture, we are most often talking about the Western classical tradition. Let's circle back to Egypt, the second, third millennium BC. As I was saying, this is where the basic tectonics that find their full realization in classical architecture were first established. Monumentality, and Egyptian architecture was imbued with cosmic symbolism, iconic forms. Then we have the Greek and Roman classicism, the second and first millennium BC through about the 5th century AD. Here's where the classical orders were first conceived and codified. And the basic composition, proportion, ornament of classical architecture was established. Certain building types of a variety of different kinds of characters were established during the Greek and Roman eras, and a varied character to the architecture depending on a variety of different uses and building types. Then we move on to medieval architecture, the 6th century through the 14th century. This is really can be seen as an outgrowth of the classical, but with very different proportional systems. So the bits and pieces of the architecture are similar, but the proportions are often dramatically different. We see the great cathedrals, Gothic cathedrals, for example, where the proportions are very stretched and attenuated. And that's often what we see in Gothic architecture. Ornament was an important factor in these medieval architecture, and more sophisticated structural systems as well. So we see the skeletonized structural systems of the Gothic cathedrals, for example, flying buttresses and these kind of creative ways to allow the architecture to really soar and to experience great spans. And also, of course, Christian symbolism was an important aspect of architecture in the medieval era. Then we move on to the Renaissance and Baroque periods, the 5th century through the 17th century. And this is really a rediscovery of the classical, where the architects, after sort of a detour into the Gothic and other styles, were returning and rediscovering the language of classical architecture as established in antiquity. Also, we see the creation of the modern city. So the European cities that we know and love today, for example, and their conception was established in the Renaissance and the Baroque periods. Then we have the neoclassicism and the historic revivals of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. This really represents a comprehensive view of the past, where architects were taking and synthesizing all of the eras of architecture of the past and creating a new synthesis with it. We see an interest in archaeological correctness. So architects were looking back and studying and quantifying the architecture of the past and creating records of that could be used by current architects and future architects. We also see lots of eclectic hybrids that come out of this comprehensive view of history. And the architecture took a creative turn in lots of different directions as architects put those pieces of those historic buildings together in new and interesting ways. And in the 20th century to the present day, we move on to modernist architecture. This is really an architecture in opposition to tradition, employing new construction materials, new technologies, exploring new building types, but really establishing a goal to kind of turn its back on tradition and what has come before and start with a clean slate. And recently, we've seen a renewal of classical architecture, a new classicism, if you will, the late 20th century to the present. This is an architecture that seeks to reconnect with tradition and moves it forward and incorporates aspects of both tradition and the modern. So I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the literature of classical architecture. This is an enormous subject and enough to consume a lifetime of study. I'm afraid we won't have time for that tonight, but what I would like to do is give you a brief exposure to some of the books and literature that I find it's most useful to the practitioner. And I like to call this the pragmatic canon. These are the books that I find most useful in the studio. These are the books that are never far from my desk, for example, and are always available to people that are working in my studio as reference, practical reference material when they're doing their own work. So I'd like to start with some of the treatises from the past. The first one is the 10 books on architecture. We spoke about that at the beginning of the lecture. That's by Vitruvius, a Roman architect from about 25 BC. There's a beautiful edition of Vitruvius edited by Thomas Gordon Smith that's available on Amazon, and I highly recommend it. As I mentioned, it's the only treatise from antiquity which survives. But interestingly, it's quite readable. There's lots of wonderful lessons by Vitruvius on building types, on building uses and character, on the classical orders. It's a wonderful read. Thomas Gordon Smith's excellent recent edition has the original text plus copious photography and Thomas Gordon Smith's beautiful illustrations, and you'll see some of those in the lecture tonight and next week. Next, we have the 10 Books of Architecture by Leon Battista Alberti from 1452. There's a beautiful Leone edition from 1755 edited that's wonderful, and that's available in a reprint on Amazon. It's a wonderful treatise by this early Renaissance master. The Leone edition, as I said, is wonderful, and it's beautifully illustrated. Next, very important, is On Architecture, the treatise by Sebastiano Serlio from 1545. Serlio was another influential Renaissance architect. His treatise is really strong on the description of different building types and also on moldings and embellishment. So it's a wonderful book to have to refer two in the studio. And then another treatise that I'd like to recommend is the Book of Architecture by James Gibbs, 1728. Gibbs was an important English architect whose work spanned the transition between the English Baroque period and the Georgian period. It contains a collection of plates representing a wonderful variety of building types and decorative elements. And Gibbs's version of the classical orders is in some ways unique and really wonderful. So I highly recommend Gibbs. The last four of these books in the pragmatic canon are the books that I believe to be the most useful. And if you only buy four of them, I would buy these four. The first one is very famous, The Four Books of Architecture, the famous Quattro Libri by Andrea Palladio from 1570. The MIT Press edition, which you see here in paperback, is available on Amazon, and I highly recommend it. It's beautifully done. This is arguably the most famous of the Renaissance treatises. And again, it's also very readable. It has a full description of the classical orders. And also one of the four books is a book on Palladio's measured drawings of Roman buildings. So Palladio toured Europe and measured Roman ruins and drew them. And they are documented in one of the four books. It's a very, very valuable resource, really wonderful. And it also contains his commentary on it. But most interestingly to me, the Quattro Libri is really the first architectural monograph in the modern sense, because one of the books is a book where Palladio shows his own work. He shows his own buildings, his wonderful villas, for example, for wealthy Venetians. And he explains them quite beautifully in the book. So we get a little insight into Palladio's rationale for the design of those buildings, his experiences with his clients and the purpose of the building. So it's really wonderful in that way, but very unusual and I think a really wonderful insight into the mind of the architect. The next one is a wonderful book with a very long and elaborate title, A Treatise on the Decorative Part of Civil Architecture by William Chambers from 1759. The version you see here is the Dover edition. It's available in paperback, also on Amazon. I highly recommend this book. William Chambers was a wonderful architect. He was George III's court architect. And George III, you may remember, was the probably most famous among Americans as the emperor that we rebelled against in the American Revolution. So he's a bit demonized in the eyes of Americans, but George III was actually a pretty sensitive fellow, a very good amateur architect and a lover of the arts and a student of architecture. And William Chambers was his teacher and his mentor. This book contains really beautiful plates of engravings on the elements of architecture, not only the classical orders, which are beautifully documented here, but lots of details of buildings, doors, windows, fireplaces, door surrounds, all of these kind of small scale, human scale details that bring the architecture alive. And it's filled with creative examples of how to do those elements within the classical language. So a wonderful book. By the way, all of these are listed in the class notes that I believe Diane sent you all a PDF of. So no need to write all these down right now. They're in the notes and you can refer to them there. Next is the American Vignola by William Ware from 1903. This is the Dover edition, again in paperback and available on Amazon. This is a book that I have many, many copies of, and they're circulating around our studio at all times. They're always on people's desks. It's important in that sense. I kind of look at the American Vignola as the Cliff Notes of classical architecture. For those of you that are old enough to remember Cliff Notes, they were the notes that you used to buy when you didn't want to read the book in high school. You could buy the Cliff Notes and they would describe the plot and the main character and plot lines of the book in a concise, straightforward way. And in a sense, that's what Ware does with the American Vignola. It's not especially creative, but it's very thorough and useful. It's kind of the opposite of Chambers that we just talked about, where Chambers dives into creative detailing. Ware doesn't do that, but he does give us a very thorough overview of the language. It's really excellent as a quick, well-organized desk reference. I think it's invaluable in that sense. And then finally, Classical Architecture by Robert Adam from 1991. This is also available on Amazon. Robert Adam is a wonderful contemporary classical architect, English architect. He won the Driehaus Prize for Classical Architecture in 2017. This book is wonderful because it's organized around plates with accompanying essays. And each one is an individual lesson on some element of the language or the philosophy of classical architecture. So you can open this book anywhere, and on the left side, you'll have a plate that illustrates the lesson, and on the right side is an essay that describes the plate and teaches you an important lesson about some element of the language. So it's really wonderful. You don't have to read it from beginning to end. You can open it anywhere and learn something. But it's very insightful. It's particularly good on details and embellishment of moldings and principles of how to approach classical architecture are really kind of brought alive by Robert Adam in this book. So now I'd like to move on to what I like to call the 10 timeless canons. These are the general meta principles of classical architecture. The approach to these principles is what conceptually differentiates classical architecture from modern architecture. And we're going to go through each one of these in order and talk a little bit about them. But this is really where we can learn and understand what makes classical architecture what it is and what makes it different from modernist architecture. First one is bilateral symmetry. This is one of the many alignments between the language of classical architecture and nature. This is where the language has embedded within it an emulation and a reflection of the natural world. This is also the highlight of the lecture because I get to show puppy pictures, which is something that everybody seems to enjoy. I certainly do. But there's a lesson here, certainly. Bilateral symmetry is commonplace in nature. It's all around us, and it's within us. Our bodies are bilaterally symmetrical. So when our buildings show this kind of symmetry, they become, in a sense, a reflection of us. Bilateral symmetry is a very effective and understandable form of visual order. Because of its ubiquity in the natural world, it is seen intuitively by us as a sign of health and normalcy, which is perhaps why so many of us find it comforting. Another source of comfort, which derives from this kind of symmetry, is that it is inherently balanced and exemplifies equilibrium. This kind of symmetrical composition often results in a preference for a centrally located entrance on the main facade of a building, usually treated in a celebrated manner to highlight its importance. One way to do this is with a pediment, which is a gabled temple-like feature which highlights the entrance of an important stature. But that's not the only way to do it. And in fact, Greco-Roman classicism is not the only form of classical architecture that employs this kind of bilateral symmetry, as you can see of the example of the Asian gateway in that image in the upper right. Next is anthropomorphism. When we looked at the importance of bilateral symmetry in classical architecture, I noted that we are bilaterally symmetrical, our bodies. This is one aspect of a prevailing anthropomorphism which pervades the language of classical architecture. The image on the right, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, is probably familiar to most of you. But what is so interesting about that image from Da Vinci's sketchbook is that he was illustrating visually a text passage from Vitruvius's treatise on architecture. Vitruvius described in words how the proportions of the human body were related to the geometry of the circle and the square and the golden ratio. Da Vinci used this image to construct and illustrate Vitruvius's observation. The orders of classical architecture are replete with alignments to the proportions of the human form, and their characteristics are often associated with human archetypes. Plan organization, facade configurations, decorative motifs often emulate the human form in one way or another. As nature organizes complex functions, so classical architects organize complex structures. And we'll see a lot more about this and learn a lot more about this as we go on with the lecture tonight and next week. Classical buildings generally have clearly defined fronts, sides, and backs, just as exist in nature. Clear and simple geometry. The geometries used in classical architecture are clear, simple, and understandable. Ambiguity is discouraged in the pursuit of legibility. Remember when we spoke about architecture as a language? The classical language is designed to be understandable, the better to reliably communicate, even to those without special knowledge. The circle and the square are the least ambiguous shapes, and thus are often used in classical architecture. When combining these basic shapes, both 2- and 3-dimensional, they should be organized harmoniously in a natural way without forcing. Circles and squares should live side by side and be governed by clear axes. The axis of symmetry is the backbone of the plan composition, as we see in the drawings on the lower part of this image. This, of course, is, again, another alignment with nature and another biomorphism that's embedded in the language. Defined space. The classical architect values spaces that are discrete, not ambiguous, that have clear definition. In classical architecture, there are rooms. These rooms can be both inside and outside of buildings. Classical rooms can vary in size and shape within a building. These figural spaces are often carved out of the spaces around them. Rooms should have corners that define the space. Openings between rooms often have thick walls that give the impression of solid load-bearing construction. In the Renaissance, architects began to respond to the developing urban environment of great European cities by designing cloisters, courtyards, squares, and plazas as outdoor rooms in the classical manner. Any visit to a great European city will prove this to be true. The juxtaposition of discrete forms. In classical architecture, every object or space is complete in itself. Components and boundaries are clearly defined. There is no ambiguity. Classical spaces are self-contained. One always knows where one is in relation to the rest of the building or the outdoor space. Again, the emphasis here is on legibility. The classical architect is endeavoring to allow the user of the building to understand the nature of the space and the user's proper relation to it. This can be seen as a reflection of philosophy, seeking to explain man's proper place in the universe. An emphasis on center, corner, and sides. A well-designed classical room has walls, floors, and ceilings which respond to each other and share common axes, elements, and articulation schemes. They are related to each other in a rational, unambiguous way. Unity and balance are achieved by utilizing a subdivision of space in each of its surfaces. Here you see a perfect example where the walls, the floor, and the ceiling exist as entities in themselves, but they're further subdivided geometrically into separate zones and separate spaces that allow us to break the scale down and relate to us more in a human scale. There's an emphasis on the center, on solid corners, and on sides. A limited inventory of parts. Classical architecture can be identified by its use of a specific set of parts. We call these the elements of classical architecture. These parts are understood as types, which are idealized form, which actual realized example specimens are derived. This concept of type and specimen is a very important theme in the philosophy of classical architecture, and one that I'd like you to remember. We'll touch a bit more on this later in the lecture. This inventory starts with the moldings, which are the basic building blocks of the orders. The orders find their fullest expression in the column. Inherent formal hierarchy. A hierarchy is the ordering of elements in order of importance. So think back and remember our anthropomorphic model. In the human body, the most important organs are located in the center and towards the top. A similar hierarchy is often found in classical architecture. This is yet another analogy between the architecture and us. The most important floor of a building is called the piano nobile, or the noble floor. This floor is usually raised above grade and has the largest rooms, the largest windows, and the highest ceilings. This hierarchical relationship should extend to the way that the plan is ordered. The largest, most important rooms are located in the central mass. Secondary supporting spaces are forms at the perimeter. And the hyphens, which are the connecting spaces, become connective tissue in a sense, as you can see in this plan. These areas, if I can use my laser pointer, yeah, these areas here, we call those hyphens. And they really can be thought of as connective tissue. Yet again, another metaphor, a biologic metaphor. Regularity. Regularity is the rhythmical repetition of elements. And this is a theme we see yet time and time again in classical architecture. Regular patterns with periodic variation to avoid monotony are stable and comforting to the eye. A geometric grid is often used as an underlying field or ground as the basic foundation used to achieve a pleasing regularity of form in a classical building, and is easily understood by the viewer. This enhances the legibility of the composition. Repeating elements in a regular pattern can strengthen the presence of a building. This strategy also maintains visual order so that observers can easily comprehend what may be a very complex building program. Tripartite organization, or the rule of three. Threeness is a structure that seems to be part of the fabric of our existence. Gravity implies that organic structures have a bottom, a middle, and a top. Trees have roots, a trunk, and a canopy. And in fact, our bodies we have feet that reside on the ground. We have a trunk of our body, and we have the head at the top. So many of our creations and social constructs are structured by threeness. Works of music, theater, literature have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Our human nature is fully intertwined in threeness. We are born, we live our lives, and we die. The composition of classical architecture often reflects this. The classical order contains the pedestal, the column, and the entablature. Columns have a base, a shaft, and a capital. And the entablature consists of the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. We'll learn more about that later. But the very geometry of the overall parts of the classical order and the subparts are all intertwined in this theme of threeness. And we see it over and over again in the language. And it's a way that feels natural to us because we're intertwined with it and we see it all around us. Our lives are embedded in threeness. In a classical composition, building facades are often subdivided into three bays, with the center bay wider, perhaps capped with a pediment, to emphasize the bilateral symmetry and the importance of the primary entrance. Another example is the Palladian window, which is this window we see on the right, which is divided into three parts. So now I'd like to look at a few of the basic rules of classical architecture. These are rules that apply to all the classical orders, and they're general sort of global rules to pay attention to and think about when designing with classical architecture. I'd like to start with the moldings. This is a chart from William Ware. This is from the American Vignola, one of the books I recommended to you earlier. And in a sense, this is a summary of all of the classical moldings. Most of the fine detail in classical buildings is built from a kit of relatively simple extruded shapes based on Platonic solids. These bits are called the moldings. And they really can be looked at as the class of the atomic units of classical architecture in a sense. They're the smallest bits that we can break classical architecture down into and have those bits retain identifiable character and geometry. So in a sense, this is the periodic table of the moldings. A working knowledge of the moldings is a very important skill to acquire. Later on in the academic season here in Southern California, I'll be teaching the classical moldings where you can take the class and learn to draw them with me. I recommend that class as a really good introduction to the geometry and the philosophy of the moldings. Here's a page from my sketchbook showing how individual moldings are used to build up elements of classical architecture. So here you can see a cross section through two different kinds of column bases. And in fact, on the right there is a very important column base called the Attic base. It's the canonical base for the Ionic order in the archetype, although you see it all over the place, not just on Ionic columns. But it consists of really simply a nested series of moldings put together to create an element, in this case, the base moldings of a classical column. And if you keep those shapes in mind, here's a finished pilaster base of that same design. This is a photo I took at the Breakers, which is the wonderful mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, designed by Richard Morris Hunt. I think this photograph really beautifully captures how the rendering of shade and shadow upon the surface of the moldings gives the architecture a wonderful, sensuous character that is really, really beautiful, and gives us a chance to appreciate detail at a fine scale, at a human scale, at the scale of a few meters away. Another page from my sketchbook, again, showing how a Tuscan cornice is built up of a series of moldings nested together again. Moldings can be grouped into general categories by geometry, but they can also be organized by function. Moldings can be seen as communicating structural information through their shape. So we can learn the moldings, and if you take the moldings class, you will learn the moldings first by geometry, as in the upper row, where we understand the geometric construction of the molding. But we can also think of moldings as indicators of structural information by their shape. Thoughtfully employed, they are like sensors distributed around the building that tell us what the building is experiencing at a particular location. So here we see the major functional groups of the moldings from the bottom up. Prone or base moldings. These are moldings that are useful to be used at the bottom of buildings. Separating, supporting, and crowning moldings. A common mistake is to use moldings from one functional category to serve an inappropriate purpose. We'll talk a bit more about that. And certainly in the moldings class, we'll dive into that in some detail. So now we'll review some of the basic canonical rules of the language of classical architecture. And we'll start with units of measurement. This is a chart, again, from William Ware's American Vignola, very useful chart that summarizes the proportions of all of the classical orders. The basic unit of measure when we talk about the classical orders is based on the diameter of the column shaft at the base of the column. And that is referred to as D, capital D for diameter. So if we look at this image of the column over here, the diameter of the shaft of the column at the bottom is D. And this becomes a modular unit which is divided or multiplied to produce ratios that determine the measurements of the other components and regulate the proportions of the order. So for example, the ratio of the Tuscan column, as you can see in this chart, is 1 to 7. In other words, it's 7 diameters tall. And because this is a relative proportional measurement and not an absolute measurement, this proportional scheme can scale up and down to conform to any size of structure. So here's a drawing from my sketchbook illustrating the same thing. This is a drawing of a portion of the Doric order, illustrating the pedestal and the column and the entablature, which is the beam-like lintel and overhang of the upper part of the order. And you can see on the left the proportions regulated as multiples of D, which is the diameter of the column at the base right here. So let's talk a bit about the components, the basic components of the order. This is William Chambers' version of the Tuscan order, a plate from his treatise, which we discussed earlier. It's a beautiful engraving, and it's illustrative of the basic construction of a classical order. The elements that you see on the left, the sub-elements of the order, are more or less the same for all of the classical orders. So this is a nomenclature that you should pay attention to. From the base of the column upward, we have, of course, the column base you see at the bottom, which consists of a plinth, which is at the bottom here. And that's usually square, almost always square in plan, and provides the kind of base molding for the order itself. And then above that is a base mold, which is round in plan, and some kind of base moldings here. Those vary depending on the orders, and as the orders become more elaborate, those base moldings become more elaborate. They're very simple here in the Tuscan. In the higher orders, they're much more elaborately molded, but they all of the orders have a plinth and then a base molding. Then we have the shaft of the column, which is abbreviated here in this illustration, so most of it is cut out. And then above that, we have the column capital here, and it consists of a few basic parts. We start with the astragal, which is a band that we often see around the necking of the column here. You can think of it as a sort of a binding band that kind of holds the top of the column at the top of the shaft. Then we have the necking, which is a portion of the shaft above the astragal. And then we have this molding here, which we call an echinus. Echinus means sea urchin. So it has the shape of an upside down sea urchin shell in it. So it's that beautiful round ovalo shape here. It's circular in plan shape. And then above the echinus, we have a flat plate at the top called an abacus. And the abacus is the top part of the classical column capital, and it's square in plan again. And you can see by how it casts shadows on the circular echinus below that it's square. Then above that, we have the entablature, and the entablature consists of three parts: the architrave, which you can think of as the beam, the lintel beam in a sense, that frames over the columns, is called the architrave. Above that, we have a frieze. The frieze you can imagine as the zone where cross beams might frame on top of the architrave. If we look at it structurally, that's what the frieze represents. It's in antiquity and in lots of creative classical and neoclassical architecture, the frieze is exuberantly decorated in a variety of different ways. And we'll see some examples of that. In the Tuscan, it's typically plain and humble, and that's what you see here. And then the top part is the cornice. And the cornice consists of a series of moldings at the top of the order. And you can think of that as the place where the rafters of the roof rafters might frame over the cross beams and overhang and create an overhang to protect the building below. That's the cornice. And then the top molding up here is often analogous to a gutter. Okay, so those are the basic parts of a classical order, and those are roughly similar in all of the classical orders. An important note that the face of the entablature here, the face of the frieze and the architrave, is in line with the necking of the column below. And so the column capital, the abacus and the echinus, stick slightly out from the face of the architrave. This is really important. If there's one thing to remember from this exploration of the elements, it's that. It's the necking of the column should always align with the face of the entablature. So here's an example of what not to do. This is a really good example of misuse of the elements. I keep a folder on my desktop, which I call the outrage file, and I file terrible examples of badly done classical architecture in it. And you'll see a few examples from the outrage file this evening, and this is certainly one of them. And this is an example of a cantilever of the architrave, which is a real no-no. There's real wisdom embedded in that rule that the face of the entablature should align with the necking of the column, because it results in buildings and structures that rest comfortably on the landscape, that feel stable and don't feel top heavy. And here's an example of what happens if you misuse those elements in that way and cantilever the entablature. You end up with a top heavy construction that looks awkward and difficult. Another example of misuse of the elements. Here we have, again, a misaligned entablature. It's not quite so egregious as the previous one, but you can see that the face of the entablature is way out from the necking of the column. You can see it here for sure. I think that builders and contractors like to do this if they're not guided in the right direction, because they feel like they need to protect the top of the column from rain or to keep birds from landing on it. But you can see that it ends up in awkward looking assemblages of forms. And there's lots of ways to deal with the water problem other than cantilevering the entablature to cover the top of the column. Here we also see a kind of grotesquely overscaled entablature and pediment above that leads to a real top-heavy feel to this building. So again, there's the rules of classical architecture that we're going to discuss this evening. They're often broken and pushed by creative practitioners, but if you push and pull them in the wrong direction, or if you push them too far, you run the risk of making mistakes and ending up with buildings that feel awkward or misaligned or top heavy. So beware. Here's an example of how to do it right. This is a building by Quinlan Terry. I'm going to try to get rid of this dialog box. There we go. This is a detail of a English country house designed by Quinlan Terry, the great contemporary classical architecture. This is a door surround for the front door. And here you can see the face of the entablature very nicely aligning with the necking of the column here. And I think you can see that results in a form that feels pleasing to the eye. It doesn't feel top heavy. If we look at the whole building here, you can see how that kind of rule applied consistently over a whole building really results in a assemblage of forms that's pleasing to the eye, that's elegant, that feels right to us. So again, there's wisdom embedded in those rules. So next I want to talk about columns and what we call diminution and entasis. This is an illustration of Vitruvius's method for constructing the tapering of a column, or what we call entasis. The shaft of a column diminishes as it rises in the language of classical architecture. And the profile of this diminution or this tapering is not straight, but curved. And this curve we call entasis, from the Latin for bending, like a bow, like an archer's bow. And that curvature generally begins at 1/3 of the height of the column, as you can see in this illustration. The lower third is cylindrical and doesn't taper, but the top 2/3 does. The column diminishes from a full column diameter, D, at the base here, to 5/6 D at the neck up here. This is true of all of the canonical orders. So all of the archetypal orders that we see in the treatises taper from a full D at the base to 5/6 D at the top. This method of establishing the curve is shown on the accompanying plate, and this is derived from Vignola. It's not the only method, but it's the most famous method. And this method results in a column with a very lively profile. So just to quickly describe it, if you take the cylindrical bottom portion of the column and imagine pulling the top portion off and just having the cylinder at the bottom, and you put a dome on top of that, that is 1D in diameter. And then we take the 5/6 D at the necking and we project that line down until it hits that dome right here. And then we take that arc length of the section of the dome and we divide it into 6 segments, as shown here, 6 radii. And then we take each one of those 6 and we project it up until it intersects 6 equal segments of the top 2/3 of the column. And we tick those little points off. That specifies the curve of the entasis. And what it really is a spiral, because it starts off tangent to or parallel to the sides of the cylinder at the bottom, but then as it ascends, it curves faster and faster as it gets to the top. So it's really a spiral that the curvature increases as it gets closer to the top of the column. And as I said, this method really results in a column that's very pleasing to the eye, and it has a really lively profile. Pilasters are half columns which are engaged with the wall. Typically, pilasters do not taper. Sometimes you see them tapering, but most often they don't. So here's a good example again from Quinlan Terry. You can tell I'm a big fan of Mr. Terry's architecture. You'll see lots of examples of his work this evening. This image shows circular engaged columns on the inside, which have entasis. And you can see those here, and you can see how they taper. And then you'll see flanking pilasters to the outside, which are engaged with the wall, and they don't taper. So this is a perfect example of that. Arches. Our discussion of arches this evening will be a very rudimentary discussion of what is a very complicated subject. But you'll find that in antiquity, classical arches are almost always semicircular. They're usually half a circle. This was true of Greek work, true of the Romans. Here you can see some details of Roman architecture showing arches that are semicircular in geometry. This is what you'll almost always see. Also, most Renaissance work. Here's a wonderful Renaissance example. This is by Andrea Palladio. This is his famous basilica in Vicenza, the Basilica Palladiana, as it's called. This is an amazing building right in the heart of Vicenza. It's really a remodeling of a previous medieval building. Palladio was asked to remodel the building and skin it in a classical skin. And he did this quite masterfully with a symphony of arched loggias on both the first and the second floor. Really quite remarkable. Here's a view from the inside of one of those loggias at the Basilica in Vicenza. And a detail of the exterior of Palladio's Basilica. Elliptical arches are often found in traditional styles derived from Roman prototypes. We often see elliptical arches employed in Renaissance work, which tended to be a bit more eclectic, a bit more exploratory than the Roman work. It's best to employ only complete half ellipses, like we see on the left, and avoid shapes that are excessively flattened. Oftentimes you'll see segmented arches like the one on the right. It's common to see that in some vernacular work, some European French architecture, vernacular architecture, sometimes employs segmented arches, which are just arches that are a segment of a circle that is less than a half circle, like you see on the right. But generally speaking, it's a good idea to avoid them if you can. The greater side thrust of an elliptical arch requires a wide pier to support it on either side, as you see in this drawing. So elliptical arches look very odd and out of place on slender freestanding columns. So that's something that you should really try to avoid. What we're trying to do is tell a believable structural story about the architecture. And an elliptical arch has so much side thrust that it really needs a thick wall on either side of it, a pier, to resist that side thrust. Whereas a circular arch, the forces are coming more or less straight down. So here's an example from the Outrage file. Here's an example of excessively flattened elliptical arches. And the problem here is compounded by the use of slender columns supporting them. And you can see how this results in an architecture that's very spindly and feels insubstantial and a bit awkward. It's certainly possible to do this with modern structural techniques. I mean, we all know here that there's probably a steel tube column inside each of these classical columns. And so it's very possible to do a construction like this with slender columns that is strong enough to stand up. But the classical architect also is concerned with telling a plausible story and creating a building that feels like it rests comfortably on the landscape. And so not only do we want to try to do a construction that will stand up, but we want to tell a good story about it as well. Cornices and other crowning elements. All of the classical orders employ a variation on a 45-degree geometry to determine the depth of crowning elements. Here we see examples of the cornices of classical entablature. And you can see the 45-degree lines that are regulating them. This is an excellent rule of thumb to keep in mind when designing cornices, ground moldings at the ceilings and at top of cabinets and furniture, tops of buildings. It provides a very good starting point. It doesn't mean that every time you design a cornice, it needs to be based on a 45-degree geometry, but it's the baseline and it's the standard that's embedded in the canon. A common mistake is to ignore this, resulting in buildings and objects that seem either top-heavy or incomplete and unfinished at the top. So my advice is to start with 45 degrees and work from there. Very often we'll change that facial angle depending on the application, but 45 degrees is the baseline, and it's a good place to start. And it makes sense structurally as well. Here's another sketch from my sketchbook just showing that same 45-degree geometric construction for both the Tuscan and the Doric cornice. Another example from the outrage file. This is a misuse of the elements in a variety of different ways. There's very little entablature here at all up here. It's reduced and insubstantial and very skinny and weak looking. The columns are just spectacularly badly detailed. There's this strange wedge-shaped thing on top of the column, which I'm sure was built there by the builder in order to keep the water off the top of the column again. It certainly is awkward looking. The other thing you'll notice here is that the columns have no entasis. They have no tapering. And this shows you an example of how inelegant and awkward they look when they don't taper. They look like soda straws instead of classical columns. And there's a real elegance and a liveliness to the profile of the entasis of a classical column that has been ignored here. And this is an outrage of a different sort. Again, a misuse of the elements. The proportions here are really misguided. Here we have Tuscan columns that are so stunted and stumpy that they feel fat and awkward and brusque. Also, again, a misalignment of the entablature. Here we have this hugely scaled entablature cantilevering over the top of the abacus of the columns in a way that makes this whole thing feel very, very top heavy. This is, of course, the Colosseum in Rome, famous and memorable and familiar, I'm sure, to all of you. I want to talk now about what we call superposition. Superposition is the placing of one order above another, as in this example, Roman amphitheaters, Roman aqueducts, many contemporary buildings. The key concepts in superposition are hierarchy and structural logic. So here's a good contemporary example. This is a residential porch by the great New York architects Ferguson and Shamamian, contemporary practicing architects. In general, the lesser order is placed below the greater. Thus, in this case, the more solid Tuscan or Doric is placed below the lighter Ionic above. The columns of the upper story should generally be of smaller diameter and scale than those below, and all the dimensions should be diminished accordingly. Another good example of this, again, is Quinlan Terry. This is a city house that he designed in London. Here you can see the columns in superposition. The columns above should generally stack directly over those below, and their axes should be in the same vertical line. And here you can see that quite easily. You can see the more robust Doric order below. And then those columns are heavier in proportion and stature. And then above we have the lighter Ionic columns. The dimensions are diminished somewhat, so they feel lighter above, and you'll notice that they stack directly over the columns below. So this is the Denver Art Museum by Daniel Libeskind. With modern engineering and building technology, it's certainly possible to create configurations such as this that seem to defy gravity. We see that all the time in modernist architecture. Look, Ma, no hands. The classical architect does not endeavor to do this. On the contrary. This is, by the way, again, by Quinlan Terry. This is his restaurant and commercial building at Richmond Riverside, which is a development, contemporary development on the Thames in London, mixed use development. As I said, classical architecture doesn't endeavor to defy gravity. On the contrary, the language of classical architecture seeks to communicate an orderly and understandable transmission of the forces to the ground. The classical architect doesn't just want to create a building that doesn't fall down. He or she creates a building which tells a story about structure. In classical buildings, you're able to see and clearly understand how the building resists the forces of gravity, because the architect has deliberately crafted a visual narrative that demonstrates this to anyone observing the building, even casually. All of the syntax is designed to support this goal. This is a narrative that's a manifestation of Vitruvius's Fermitas. So this concludes part one of our lecture. Thank you so much for attending this evening. Tonight, we've learned a bit about the underlying ethos of classical architecture. We've come to understand some of the core values which distinguish classical architecture from modernist architecture. And we've explored some of the important elements of that language and some of the rules which govern it. So next week, we'll take a close look at the classical orders. We'll learn what an order of architecture is, and we'll take a close look at the canon of the orders and what distinguishes one from another. And we'll explore the deep philosophy of classical architecture and what makes it such an expressive and facile language. So I look forward to sharing all of you with this during part two. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. If you've added them to the Q&A, I'm happy to answer them. And if you want to do that now, you certainly are welcome to do that. I am going to stop sharing, if I can get over there. There we go. Great. Okay. Winston, maybe you can help me parse through. It looks like we have a lot in the chat. So maybe some of that is Q&A.
Yeah, I opened up the Q&A and we have one question who wanted to know if this is Sir John Soane's museum that you're sitting in. So,
You win the prize, my
Yeah.
friend,
yes.
my friend Anonymous.
Yes.
It is absolutely John Soane's drawing room, which I love, and I love being there, even if I'm just virtually there.
Yeah. Maybe you could have a bed and breakfast experience there.
Perhaps so.
We have a lot of questions or things in chat here. So
Yeah, I'm not seeing many questions, actually. I'm seeing more compliments, which is lovely. So thank you so much for all the lovely feedback and complimentary comments. I'm very grateful.
Yeah.
Elaine asks, is 45-degree baseline showing a 45-degree line from the end of the cornice to the center line of the column shaft? You should go back and take a look at it. It does relate to the, and I'm going to go back and take a peek at that. It doesn't actually go to the center of the column because the column is a little further out than that, but there is a 45-degree geometry that regulates the height of the architrave, which is the lowest portion of the entablature that's based on the center line of the column. But the 45-degree geometry is really a guide to the way the crowning moldings of the entablature relate to each other. So that 45-degree line kind of regulates those moldings as they go out from the face of the entablature. Great. Well, it seems that that was the only substantive question. I'm grateful for you all attending this evening. The handout that I sent you contains a basic outline of what we talked about tonight and what we will explore next week for your reference. It's not necessarily important that you follow down it during the talk, but it's good as a reference guide afterwards. And I look forward to seeing you all next week.